And what we're going to do today, because we were off for a week or two, we're going to start a new section in Maimonides, but it relates to the previous discussions because if you remember, the last section we studied was schirut, the laws of the renter. And that we began that law by discussing the fact that in the Torah, there are 4 categories of guardians. There's 4 ways, 4 different categories where I protect or I have your object. And then depending on what category I am, that would determine my responsibility to return it to you in case it was lost or stolen or other things happen. And the 4 categories were, again, we mentioned it in Maimonides, it's in the Mishnah, but it's also written in the Torah. The 4 categories were, we had the paid guardian, the unpaid guardian, and then we had the renter, and then the borrower. So the renter we discussed, I think there were 14 chapters about renter. There, Maimonides expanded. It wasn't just if I rent your object, but what happens if you hire me to do work? So a lot of the laws of working for somebody else and responsibility of the employee to the employer and of the employer to the employee, and what happens if there's disputes, whether he was paid or not paid, et cetera, all that was in the general category of the laws of the renter. But now we go to the laws of she'ela ופקדון, the laws of borrowing and entrusting something to be watched, to be guarded. And we begin with the law of the borrower. And just to remember, we said that basically, when you want to evaluate what the responsibility is, you want to look at who derives benefit. And the more benefit you derive, the more liability you have. And in that case, the extreme case is the renter, the borrower. If I borrow something from you, I, the borrower, have all the benefits. I get to use it. You, the one who lent it to me, you get nothing in return. So therefore, I get all the liability, right? The other extreme would be the unpaid guardian. Unpaid guardian, you're going away on vacation. You want me to watch your item, guard your item. You give it to me. You don't pay me. I get no benefit. I'm not allowed to use it. I'm not borrowing it. I'm not allowed to use it. So I get no benefits. You get all the benefits. So because I, the borrower, gets no benefits, I, the borrower, have very little liability. I have no liability unless I was negligent. But generally speaking, lost, stolen, I'm not liable. So these are the extremes. And then the paid guardian and the renter are in between, because the paid guardian, who gets benefits, both people get benefits. The guardian gets payment, so he gets some benefit, and the owner of the object gets a benefit that his object is being protected. Same thing with the renter. The renter, I pay the owner, so the owner gets payments, but the renter, the person renting, gets the usage. He's allowed to use the car. So they both split the benefits. And therefore, the law breaks down that if it's lost or stolen, the paid guardian has to pay. But if it's something that's out of very unusual, out of his control, onus, he was coerced. In other words, there was a sort of an act beyond my control, then the guardian does not have to pay. So that's the spectrum of the 4 guardians and the liability. And we want to think about, like I said, we think about the way to figure out how much my liability is how much benefit I receive. So we're going to begin today. We're going to begin. The beginning, it's always relatively straightforward. And we're going to talk about the borrower. And like we said, the borrower gets all the benefit. He gets all the liability. There's only one exception, which we'll talk about. And then we'll see how even things that appear simple in Maimonides and in the Talmud, once you get to the later generations, we found a way to complicate everything. And this philosophical questions of what exactly is the determining factor, and that would have various ramifications. Hopefully we'll get into that as well a little bit today, at least for a few minutes. Okay, so here we are. We are Maimonides, Introduction to Hilchot She'ela ופקדון, which is the laws of She'ela's borrowing. Pekadon is giving something to someone to guard. So what Maimonides explains, what is the scope? What are we going to cover in this section? They contain 2 positive mitzvot. The first, the laws pertaining to borrowers, and the second, the laws pertaining to an unpaid watchman. These mitzvot are explained in the chapters that follow. I believe there are 8 chapters about the borrower and the unpaid watchman, the shomer chinam, the unpaid watchman. Okay, so here we go. We'll jump right in. When a person borrows utensils or an animal or other movable property from a colleague, and it is lost or stolen, or even if it is destroyed by factors beyond his control. For example, an animal is injured, taken captive, or dies, right? If something is lost or stolen, I had control over it. I could have guarded it better. But if the animal has a heart attack and dies, there's nothing I could have done. It's beyond my control. In Hebrew, it's called a onus. I was forced. It was coerced. There was nothing I can do, regardless what the situation is. So in other words, even if it was lost or stolen or destroyed by factors beyond my control, the borrower is required to make restitution for the entire worth of the article. I borrowed it, I have to repay. Even if you say it wasn't my fault, it was lost, it was stolen, or even if it was something that was totally beyond my control, it doesn't matter. I have to pay the whole amount. How do you know? It states so explicitly in Exodus in the Torah, the 2nd book, chapter 22, we have a clear verse. If a person borrows an animal from a colleague, and it will become injured or die, and the owner is not with him, he must make financial restitution. Okay, so this is the general rule. The general rule is the borrower always has to pay if something was lost or stolen. I think, we have Andy here, I think it's called strict liability. You're always liable to pay, no matter what.
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. I remember something from reading up. Okay, that's the law. And as I said, because you look at who gets the benefits in the borrower-lender relationship, the borrower gets all the benefits. Therefore, the borrower gets all the responsibility. Like we said, other cases, if the paid guardian, the unpaid guardian, that breaks down a little bit differently. Okay, now there's one exception. There's one exception. What is the exception? The exception is if I borrow something for you to do work, and while I am using that item to work in the normal manner, it breaks or the animal dies, then I am not responsible, even though I'm a borrower and I have all the liability. Why not? Because I'm acting within the mandate. You gave me something to use and I used it in the normal fashion and it broke. I did exactly what I told you I was going to do. So for example, if I borrow an ox and I say, can I borrow your ox today? I have to plow my field. And then I plow my field. And in the middle of the plowing of the field, the animal drops dead. Okay, that's not the other case. I borrow your ox and I say, I got to plow my field. It will take me a week. Can I borrow your ox for a week? You say you're very generous. You say, sure. So I plow day 1. I put the ox in the stable. I don't know if you use a stable for oxen. Maybe you do, maybe you don't know if it's a different word. You put the ox in the stable, and at midnight, the ox died. What's the law? I have to pay. The borrower has to pay. Why does the borrower have to pay? I did nothing wrong. It was beyond my control. Yeah, but you're a borrower. A borrower always has to pay no matter what. Okay, that's clear. The exception is if I borrowed your ox to plow my field and the animal died while I was plowing my field, you say that I don't have to pay. I did exactly what you expected me to do. And I borrowed it for work and it died during the work, I am not liable. So any scenario you can come up with, the borrower is always liable, always has to pay. There's only one scenario where he does not. It's called meta machmat malacha. It died while, we'll get into the while or because, that's another discussion, but literally died because of doing work. So now Maimonides is going to give us a few examples of this scenario, all the way down. We're in the second paragraph of 1, we'll get down to 2, and then we'll try to dig a little bit deeper. Says Maimonides as follows. Number 2, when does the above apply? In other words, when does it apply that the borrower always has to pay? When the loss due to factors beyond his control does not take place while the borrower is working with the animal. If, however, a person borrows a colleague's animal to plow and it dies while plowing, the borrower is not liable. If, however, the animal dies before he plowed with it, or after he plowed with it, or he rode upon it, or he threshed with it, and the animal died while he was threshing or riding, the borrower is liable to make financial restitution. Similar laws applies in all analogous situations. So Maimonides added some examples. So what happens if I say, can I borrow your ox to plow my field? And you say, okay. So I get onto the ox to ride it, or I use the ox to thresh, to step on the grain. That's what they used to do in the olden days, to separate the kernel from the chaff. So I'm using it for something other than I told you, and it died. Even if it died with in a way that's beyond my control, I'm always liable. So in other words, the borrower is always liable, unless it died while I was doing the exact thing that I told you that I'm borrowing it for. And now we have more examples. Similarly, if a person borrows an animal to travel to a particular place, and the animal dies under him on that journey, he borrows a bucket to fill water with it, and it falls apart in the cistern while he is filling it. He borrows a hatchet to split wood, and it breaks because of the chopping while he is splitting the wood. He is not liable. Similar laws apply in all analogous situations. The rationale is that he borrowed the article solely to perform this task, and he did not deviate from his original request. You cannot make me liable for doing exactly what you told me I could do, and I didn't deviate from what I said I was going to do. But if I deviate, so for example, you ask me I borrow your ox to plow the field, and I use it for something else, and it dies beyond my control, I don't have to pay. So that is number one. These are the general rules. If I ask you on one foot, we have 8 chapters on this, but if I ask you on one foot, give me in short, what is the law about a borrowed item? The answer is the borrower always has to pay no matter what happens. If it's beyond, a tsunami arrives, it's beyond my control, it doesn't matter. The borrower always has to pay, with one exception. The exception is if the animal died or the object broke while I was doing the work, and the work that I said I was going to do. In that case, I'm not liable. So that's the law. Anyone has comments and questions, please share. Otherwise, we start drilling in and we start thinking about complicating this very simple, straightforward law. Okay, you ready to think about some Talmudic logic from the post-Talmudic sages? So this question, this discussion arrives way after the Talmud and after Maimonides, but it's still very interesting to think. Actually, it's not. It's the contemporaries of Maimonides, the early commentators. Maimonides' contemporaries are already asking this sort of question, and what they would call it in the yeshiva, they would call it a chakira. Chakira would mean an investigation. And really what we're doing here is we're asking a question that on the surface seems to be just like a very technical question, but it isn't, because it really seeks to refine and clarify what exactly is the parameter of the reason. And we want to clarify the precise, we want to give a precise definition of the law. And the reason why the precise definition of the law isn't interesting, not just for semantics, even though on the surface it looks like it's semantics, but we will always have to see any such question that seeks to clarify the exact definition of the law has to have what they call in the yeshiva nafka mina in Aramaic, which means something has to be a tangible a difference between the two scenarios. So in other words, if I ask you the definition of this law, is it A or is it B? It can't just be semantics. I have to say, if it's A, you would get one result. If it was B, you would get a different result. So you have to actually show that this philosophical, theoretical question has a real life manifestation, because if it doesn't, you're just wasting our time. So case in point, instead of giving introductions, I'm going to tell you exactly what the sages are discussing, what the early commentators are discussing about this law. So what do we know about the borrower? We know, as I said many times in the last 28 minutes, we know that I borrowed it. I'm the borrower. I have full liability. Why do I have full liability? Because all of the benefit is mine. Kol hana shalai. All the benefit is mine. Okay. We want to now take that apart and dissect it and say, what exactly does that mean? Option one, the borrower, when the Talmud says that the reason why the borrower has strict liability is reliable completely, because the borrower gets all the benefit. Option one means simply, the borrower is the only one that gets benefits. The person who lent it to me gets no benefit at all. So because I am the only one, the borrower is the only one. In other words, I would say it's exclusive. If you want to translate the question in English, when you say the borrower is the only one that gets the benefit, you mean the borrower exclusively gets benefits. That's one way of thinking about this question. And the second way, and like I said, it's not just going to be semantics, it's going to be important, as we will demonstrate. The second way, it's not that the borrower is the one that's exclusively getting benefits. It's something else. It is that the borrower gets all the benefits without having to pay anything. Okay? So option A, when the Talmud says that all the benefit belongs to the borrower, and therefore the borrower gets all the liability. Option A means that the borrower receives the benefit exclusively. The borrower is the only one that gets the benefits. That's one way of understanding the Talmud. The second way of understanding the Talmud, no, it doesn't mean that the borrower is the only one exclusively who gets benefits. But what we mean is the borrower is not paying for any of the benefit he receives. And because he's not paying for any benefit he receives, he gets the full liability. Now, if you're like me, these two options sound very similar. But as soon as I give the scenario, there'll be a scenario, you'll understand why option A and B are totally different, and why it's important to clarify what does the Talmud mean when the Talmud says that the reason why the borrower is liable is because all the benefit is his. Okay, so here's the scenario. Let's produce a scenario as follows. I come to Andy and I say, Andy. Okay, that's not the other way around. Vicky goes to Andy and says, look, Andy, do me a favor. I'm going to pay Andy. Vicky says she'll pay Andy $100 if Andy will be kind enough to agree to lend me, Menachem, his ox. That's the scenario, right? Standard, what does a borrower mean? Borrow means I come to Andy and say, Andy, could I please borrow your ox? I pay nothing. That's borrower. Renter is I come to Andy and I say, Andy, can I use your ox? I'll pay you $100. Okay. What happens if I borrow from Andy, which means I get Andy's ox and I paid nothing. But the problem is somebody else paid Andy to loan me his ox. So now it's a little bit of a mess. Now it gets complicated. How do I take this apart? How do I dissect this? So here's the scenario. So Vicky pays Andy $100 so that when I ask Andy for his cow, for his ox, Andy would say, sure, I'm giving it to you. You don't have to pay. I'm loaning it to you. Okay. Then the ox drop dead. Now the question is, do I have to pay? Well, what does the Talmud say? The Talmud says, I get all the benefits. So therefore I have to pay. Slow it down. I didn't get all the benefit in this case. Andy got the benefit. He got $100 from Vicky. Okay, I didn't pay him $100, but who cares? Vicky paid him $100. So if you look at the question and you say, that when the Talmud says the borrower gets all the benefit and therefore is liable, that means the borrower exclusively, the borrower is the only one who gets benefits. Then in this scenario, where Vicky paid Andy to loan me the object, in this scenario, I wouldn't have to pay if it dropped dead beyond my control. Why? Because I say, Andy, you got $100, you got some benefit as well, right? If the meaning is that that the borrower is liable when he gets all the benefit, meaning when he's the only one who gets benefits. Exclusively the borrower gets benefits. So that's option A. Under option A, I wouldn't have to pay Andy because even though I'm a borrower, I didn't give Andy any benefits, but Andy got benefits. So if he got benefit, he doesn't get reimbursed in a case that's beyond my control. But if you say no, the Mishnah never meant, the Talmud never meant that I, the borrower, have to be the one who exclusively gets all the benefit. That's not what the Mishnah meant. What the Talmud meant is that I, the borrower, because I get all the benefits, therefore, I have to pay. I get all the benefit means I get full benefit and I don't have to pay anything. So because I don't have to pay anything, I'll have to pay if something dies out of my control. In other words, when we say I get all the benefit, the borrower gets all the benefit, we don't mean the borrower exclusively gets the benefit. We mean the borrower does not have to pay for the benefit he receives. So if I look at it from the second way, then in this case, I will have to pay Andy for the ox that died. The fact that Andy got benefit from Vicky is irrelevant to me because I got all the benefit myself. In other words, I got a full package of benefit and I didn't have to pay for that benefit. So here you go. That's the question. So what do we have so far? I hope it wasn't too complicated. You'll chime in and tell me if it was too complicated. But what do we have so far? We have a statement from the Mishnah and a statement that the Talmud clarifies, and Maimonides quotes, but it doesn't go further than that. They say, borrower always has to pay. Why? Okay, we forget about the exception if it dies during the work. We'll talk about that later. But borrower always has to pay. Why? Because borrower gets all the benefits. Okay, very good. What does that mean? What happens if the borrower gets all the benefits, but the lender also got benefit from a third party? Because Vicky gave Andy $100 to loan me his ox. Oh, now it depends. We don't know. If you believe that the Talmud statement that says that the borrower gets all the benefit, therefore he's liable, means the borrower is the exclusively gets benefits, then in this case, Andy got his $100. I don't have to pay Andy for loaning me the ox. The ox dying. But if you believe that what it means is forget about Andy, we look at the borrower, and the borrower himself got a package of benefits. I get to use your ox, and I paid nothing for that obligation. Therefore, I'm completely liable. Then you would say, in this case, I do have to pay Andy. And the fact that Andy got $100 from Vicky is none of my business. So this is something that is unresolved. In other words, there's different opinions. There's Rashba, there's Ran. These are early commentators, that they call Rishonim, the early commentators, live a little bit after Maimonides, 12th century, 13th century, and they debate this question. So what to do is a good question. You got to check the code of law, but you see that there's two ways of thinking about this, of what exactly does it mean that all of the benefit belongs to the borrower? Does it mean?
Rabbi,
yeah.
Does any of that analysis ask if it depends on whether the borrower knows that the third party, Vicky, is paying the lender?
I don't think that's they don't. It doesn't seem from what I see here in the book here, in the book, the commentaries, it doesn't see that anybody makes that a determining factor. The knowledge of me that's not so important. The importance is, are we looking at, when you have this relationship, are we looking from the perspective of the borrower? And therefore the borrower says, we look at the borrower and the borrower, I get all the benefit, I get no payment, I get all the benefits, I have no I don't have to pay anything. Therefore, I agree to take upon myself liability. So that's one view. The other view looks from so I think that's the borrower perspective. The other view would look at the renter's perspective. Forget about the borrower. We look at the renter. You're Andy. You're giving up your ox. You're expecting something in return, either payment or the knowledge that if something happens, there will be you'll be reimbursed. So if we look from the perspective of the lender got his $100. He's happy. Doesn't really matter who he got it from. So in other words, we have a relationship here between a borrower and a lender. we have the statement that the borrower gets all the benefits, but we're not clear. That's what I said, it's a chakira. You have to refine. You have to refine what exactly are we saying? What is the determining factor? Is the determining factor the perspective of the borrower or the perspective of the lender? So what you're saying, Andy, is that, well, do I know about it? I don't see anybody who mentioned that, but again, just because I don't see it doesn't mean that it's not out there somewhere.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, thank you for this example. I think it's a classic example of how to look to the scenario from both sides.
Right. Here, you're going to say you could look at it from the perspective of the borrower, and from the perspective of the borrower, it's sort of the lender is altruistic. In other words, I gave you nothing and I got all the benefit. I should be grateful, and grateful means I should accept upon myself liability. But if you choose to look from the perspective of the lender says the lender. Remember, because if I would give Andy the $100, everybody agrees that I wouldn't be responsible for something beyond my control, like the animal dropping dead, right? Because it's not my fault, and I'm not the one, and Andy got some benefits, so we divide liability. So it's clear that if I gave Andy the $100, I wouldn't be liable. The fact that Vicky gives Andy the $100, does that make a difference? Well, it depends if you're looking from the perspective of the borrower or the perspective of the lender, right? So we really determine, what we're trying to do is we have a Talmudic statement. All the benefit goes to the borrower. The question is, what does that mean? From the borrower's perspective or from the lender's perspective?
Right. I think the benefit from it's not even in the resolution of this conflict, but in a discussion itself.
Yes.
The only problem I have at the third party that nobody takes my point of view into consideration.
Your point of view, it doesn't matter what you think. In other words, you did a very big mitzvah because you motivated Andy to loan me the ox, but you're certainly not liable because you got no benefit. You only got cost, right? You only lost. So there's no question, no one's going to come and bill you, right? You're for sure off the hook. The question is, the liability is spread between the people who derive benefits. Well, we know that the borrower got the borrower got a ton of benefits, so he gets liability. But we say, one second, but if it's totally out of my control, usually the borrower would get the liability because nobody else got benefit. But in the case where Andy gets benefits, could we push some of the liability back? Now, to Vicky, you get no benefit at all. So no one's gonna want to give you liability. You just did a mitzvah. So for me, what's interesting is, so what Vicky is really saying is that this would help you even beyond this law, because this would help you is between any transaction between people, any relationship between people. If you do something nice for me, and I say, well, you may have another motivation, does that detract from the gratitude that I should have for you, right? So the
moral lesson is much greater than the actual practical.
I wouldn't say greater, I would say broader. It's broader. It applies to many more cases, right? Let me give you an example. The example is, I just told someone, I got 2 books, I got 2 copies of the same book. So I said, I'll give it to somebody else. Now that person should be grateful. I gave them a free book. But if they look from my perspective, you don't have to be that grateful. I had an extra book. I don't want to store it on my shelf. I'll give it away, right? So if they choose to look from my eyes, then the gratitude is diminished, right? So there's always, on the other hand, you say, what does that recipient care that I got it from somebody else? I'm kind, I gave it to them, right? So there's always, in any dynamic, you can always look at it from both perspectives and see and see if for the benefit of the recipient or the benefit of the giver, and every question could be really thought about from both those perspectives. So I think that's the benefit that we get from today.
So is there a right answer, or
a right answer?
Is the answer it depends?
No, the answer is it depends who you follow. There is a clear answer. In other words, if you've asked the Rashba, he would say one thing. If you asked the Ran, he would say something else. Is it brought down in the code of law? That's the question. I don't think the code of law addresses it. So, I don't think the code of law addresses it. I will double check. That's my homework. That's my homework for later this morning. I will double check. At least from what I see here, I don't see anyone saying that the code of law addresses it, which is why look, you're a lawyer, you can't spell out every case, right? So the Talmud spelled out some, the early commentators spelled out, the code of law cannot cover everything. And that's the job of the post-Talmudic sages to apply and figure out, and that would be the question, when the Talmud said something, what does it mean? Does it mean A, does it mean B? That would determine if we look from the perspective of the borrower or of the lender. So the answer is, it's actually interesting. If it's undecided, then it depends. Then the rabbis who are going to rule on this question are going to have to think about it, decide what's logical, take a vote, and do what makes sense to them, because both are legitimate. Both are legitimate perspective based on the Talmudic logic. But not everything can be spelled out. Not everything can be ruled upon. But I may be wrong. It could be it is spelled out, so I'm going to look. I'm going to look into it. Okay, I think we'll stop here because the next section is another whole discussion. 10:44. I think we'll stop here today. We'll do a short one, a little shorter. It's good to get back into the routine of studying a little bit of Talmud and a little bit of Maimonides on Tuesday mornings. So thank you everybody for joining, and have a wonderful day. So we studied one section, one paragraph of one chapter. We have another 8 chapters in this section. So God will give us good health and peace of mind to be able to study and continue exploring the Torah, and most importantly, applying it to our life. So thank you for joining.
Thank you,
Rabbi. Have a nice day.
Wonderful day. Take care.